Good morning, everyone. I'm Patricia Albanese, the incoming president of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I was saying 2 days on the job, so bear with me. I am pleased to welcome you here to this incredibly important session on Gathering Strategies, Action 1, Recruitment and Retention of Indigenous Faculty. This session has been generously funded by the University of Regina and the Indigenous Advisory Circle, so thank you very much. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather. It is Treaty 4 land, the territories of the Nihiwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. We are grateful for the hard work and preparations for the week undertaken by our Congress host, the University of Regina. And we thank them and the Indigenous communities in Regina for an incredibly warm and wonderful welcome here on this territory. I have the pleasure of now introducing William Lindsay, who has done a tremendous amount of work to prepare this session and who will be leading us through a number of conversations today. So thank you, William. William has worked for many years as an Indigenous teacher, professor, student services provider, and senior administrator at numerous lower mainland colleges and universities. More recently, he served as the director of the Office for Aboriginal Peoples at Simon Fraser University. And now he is the special advisor on Aboriginal Affairs at SFU, working with the Vice President Academic and the Vice President External Relations, while at the same time completing his doctoral degree in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University, researching the indigenization of universities through Indigenous leadership. I asked him when he actually sleeps. It's incredible. Without further ado, I'd like to invite William to do the honors of introducing the opening ceremony for this session and to subsequently take the lead on running the session. So thank you very much, William.
Oh, thank you. Quite an introduction there. I wasn't expecting that. So we've acknowledged the traditional territories, like I'm pleased to see happen here at this university. We've gotten the habit of that at Simon Fraser University as well. And I've long been doing it at UBC, where I used to work prior to SFU. At this time, we want to call up our Elder Noel Starblanket, and he's an elder and life speaker, really well known. I've known of Noel for many, many years, and it's finally a pleasure to meet him today. And he's going to open our session with a few words. And we have a presentation of tobacco to give to initiatives, so I'm sure some of the crowd will come here as well. Could we just put the schedule up, next one here? We will try to keep on schedule this morning, ladies and gentlemen. So we've had our opening. We'll have a chance here to have each of the panel members introduce themselves and briefly mention some of the overall reconciliation efforts happening at the institutions they work for. Then we'll have our main presentation. We have some prepared questions. These will be up on PowerPoint as well. And then we'll have some audience participation as well near the end. Questions and answers, comments from the audience as well. So you'll have a part. So any questions you might have, write them down, and we'll have a chance to, or comments, and we'll have a chance to share those as well. And then we might have time for a few final summations and final thoughts before the session ends at lunchtime. Can we just go to the next slide, please? Panel presenters. So we have a very esteemed panel here. Colonel Justin Williamson from the University of Saskatchewan, Kevin Lamoureux from the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as University of Winnipeg, Bob Casey's, good. Vice President Academic for the beautiful and nearby First Nations University of Canada. Please check the building out if you haven't had a chance to do so yet. It's absolutely gorgeous. Ralph Nielsen, President and Vice Chancellor of Vancouver Island University, and myself, from Simon Fraser University, currently Special Advisor on Aboriginal Affairs at the university. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here's the panel purpose here today. So we do have a very specific purpose and trying to keep things within confined guidelines, otherwise they end up going all over the place. So we're going to specifically discuss the practice of recruiting and retaining Indigenous faculty members as part of the reconciliation efforts currently underway at institutions around the country. We have panelists from different universities, so we'll explore some of the opportunities and challenges associated involved with the hiring of and retaining of Indigenous faculty, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, with a focus on the social sciences and humanities. And the goal is to identify strategies and structural changes that are necessary to ensure Indigenous perspectives and peoples can be a part of and can thrive in post-secondary education. So here's the goal of today's endeavor. And so just to begin with our panel here, we'll have some official introductions from each member and a little bit of statement regarding reconciliation endeavors at the panelists' respective institutions. I've said about 5 minutes apiece, so I didn't bring my cane, I didn't bring my bell to go ding, ding, ding. So we'll endeavor to keep things on track as we will, so hopefully we can stay roughly within the guidelines with regards to time that we do have today. All right, so I do have a bit of an order of presentation here as well. So why don't we get Kevin to speak first, and you can let us know a little bit about where you're from, traditional territory you're from, and a bit about reconciliation happening where you're involved, which is a lot, of course.
All right. Bonjour, Anin, Hogamama Egan, Indigenous, Crane River in Dunjaba, Winnipeg in Dunjaba. Kishmagwich na dinaway mga nadag. Nimenoya, Gaye, Nimewandam, Iwanama Nungam, Minongijigad. My name is Kevin Lamoureux. I am here on behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and I bring greetings on behalf of Rai Moran, our director. And I also work for the University of Winnipeg as Associate Vice President, Indigenous Affairs, and I bring greetings on behalf of my president, Dr. Annette Trimby. I want to thank Elder Starblanket for that introduction. I don't know if you realize this, I'm sure that you do, but he was very generous with his sharing of knowledge this morning, and I was very humbled by that. I also want to thank the organizers for starting with a land acknowledgement. I've been hearing some rumblings in academia, and maybe it's just the nature of us academics, and we like to debate things and put some troubling thoughts out there about land acknowledgements, and maybe the suggestion that they've become token. And maybe that's true in some cases, maybe they have. But I'm also reminded that I grew up in a Canada where for almost in my entire life, that was never done. And so I still feel a sense of excitement whenever I hear a land acknowledgement. It makes me feel good. It seems appropriate. It seems like, at the very least, a gesture of a willingness to enter into a relationship, and I think that that's important. So I welcome debate and I welcome critical thought, but I also am very, very grateful anytime I hear a land acknowledgement. I'm here from Treaty 2. My grandparents on my father's side of the family, Ranvilles, come from Crane River, from Ebb and Flow, St. Rose de Lac, Eddystone area. My grandparents actually grew up right near Manitoba House, which is where Treaty 2 was signed. I'm very proud of that. My grandparents on my mother's side of the family are Ukrainian, all the way from Ukraine. Fled Ukraine after World War I to escape Soviets, and I'm told that if we had not, we would have faced persecution and death. And so it was quite literally a function of treaty that my family was allowed to continue to exist. And so on both sides of my family, I feel a great sense of pride and a sense of gratitude that goes down to the core of who I am for being able to say that I'm a treaty person. I also want to acknowledge my dear friend Becca. It's her birthday. It was her birthday yesterday, and I know that she's really wanting all of us to turn around and look at her and say, "Happy birthday, Becca," for... I know that she did not want me to do that. I also want to acknowledge something else, and it's a little bit sad actually, and I'm just going to make myself vulnerable and put it out there that I'm a little bit sad this morning. I don't know how many people read the newspaper headlines that our Prime Minister has decided that we're going to go ahead with that pipeline and that conversation is over, and that he's offering indemnification for Kinder Morgan to guarantee that any political controversy that arises, that they'll be protected from that. Which means that the conversation is over in terms of whether or not we are going to protect Medeyaki, kind-hearted Mother Earth. And I'm reminded, of one of the greatest moments I had in my life as an adult, and I know that I'm just about out of time, but I'll share this very, very quickly, was watching the nations come together at Standing Rock. And when President Obama decided in favor of those water protectors, and then that decision was reversed by President Donald Trump. To have had so much hope in a prime minister that maybe we are going to commit to a different relationship with one another, to see that headline today is very hurtful on a level of just identity, I suppose. That's where we still are. And I think that really speaks to the conversation that we're having here. That moment that I had when I first looked at my daughter when she was born into this world and everything that I wanted for her. And my grandchildren who I haven't met yet, and their kids, the question of whether or not we want to protect Métis for them, I guess, has been decided for at least another generation, that it's not a priority. And so maybe that does ground our conversations here in post-secondary in terms of what we value and what we see as being important for the advancement of knowledge of humankind. It's a very pivotal turning point for us, I think. And so I come from Manitoba. I'm happy to be here, and I've taken too much time. Miigwech.
You have to be sitting in the right order.
Oh, we're in good shape? That was by your plan. Good morning. I'm Ralph Nilsson. I'm from Vancouver Island University, and very, very proud to be back in Regina. I was here on this campus for not quite 20 years and appreciated every bit of learning and knowledge that I was able to garner while I was a part of this community. My family all comes from Norway. They were all settlers here in Saskatchewan. They were homesteaders, part of that great group of folks that were lured by the British landholding companies that were given the task of bringing in immigrants into the province and that homestead. Everybody given a quarter section of land and continued to proceed and develop. And that was in the early 1900s that they came, and evolved and grown in the province. My parents still live in this province. My grandparents all came from Norway, the west coast of Norway, and they came in and they learned and they grew. Came from a very strong background of social justice out of Norway, but still had very, very little education to provide me when I was growing up in this province and other provinces in the West to really understand what was going on. But I've been very, very fortunate to have many, many people in the communities who helped me understand and help me grow and help me appreciate much of the history that now we're seeing brought forward through TRC, but even before that through the Royal Commission, where I testified, and also the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and all the incredible work that was done there. And we've got a lot of challenges in front of us, and I think we've just scratched the surface. I just want to start my talk by thanking the elder, recognizing the territories we're on, but even more so the elder in terms of the welcome. Starting off this session with a good heart and a good mind is very, very important, and everything that we do and the work that we do at Vancouver Island University is based on that premise of working with a good heart and a good mind and making sure that we're developing all the work that we do in respect and reciprocity with the communities on lands who they have welcomed us. The other thing I want to recognize is the incredibly inclusive welcome that the elder provided us, and I want to thank you very much, Elder Starblanket, for that, because the explanation of how inclusive that welcome is clearly demonstrated in every community that I've been. There hasn't been, even though we see the history that we're now ensuring that Canadians are starting to understand throughout all the communities, the incredible devastating history of what we as a country have done through public policy. Yet the communities provide that kind of a welcome, that kind of an inclusive welcome, and that the strength of that can't be understated. We have to recognize that in the context of the work that we do at universities and make sure that as we evolve, that we develop that same level of respect and that same generosity of spirit that indeed continues to be provided by these communities. And if we don't do that, we're not being honest in the context of really taking on the challenges that exist in this country. And if we don't do that, then we are not upholding the principles that indeed we're saying we're going to hold when we sign on as a country to UNDRIP, when indeed we recognize the TRC and accept not only the TRC, but the Royal Commission and all the work that the Healing Foundation did. So I think we've got huge responsibility in this country and a long way to go. But the incredible thing that I think provides a path for us, it's very, very clear, is that incredible generosity of spirit and the willingness of the nations to continue to hold us up as we learn, to continue to hold us up as we ensure that we're moving forward. We do a lot of work at our institution. It's telling me.
I don't know how to help you.
Yeah, I don't know how to help it either. So I got 1 minute left. That was my 1 minute warning. At Vancouver Island University, we've taken a lot of steps in a variety of different ways to break the rules and to not just see what's on black and white on the paper and follow the rules that come in public policy, or indeed they're in place relative to much of the work that is provided for universities to do. A big one for hiring faculty members. And I'll talk about this more later, we recognize elders as faculty, and our faculty union has recognized elders as faculty. We pay them on exactly the same scale. And it's the only way we can develop the recognition and respect. If we're going to sit and talk and see each other, then we have to recognize the different ways of knowing and the different ways of understanding, and recognize somebody with grade 3 education but's been educated by the community their whole life has an incredible depth of knowledge that we indeed are benefiting from. So how do we respect that? Other one that we've just done is I sit as an adjudicator for the politics of many of the bands when they have a vote, and they ask me to be the committee. And so I get to know many of the committees, whether it be Cowichan, whether it be Sinamuk, whether it be whoever in the region. And I find that there's an incredible number of voters south of the border that are members of the nation. Yet, if they want to come to school in Canada, they pay international tuition fees, which is nonsense, because in UNDRIP, we have a nation-to-nation recognition. So what we've done is we just throw out that notion, and every Indigenous student that comes that's from Canada, that lives in the United States, comes to Canada to school, they pay domestic tuition. We recognize them as domestic. And we're very funny, we just had a Border Patrol person call us and say, you know, you've got somebody that's sneaking up to Canada and taking classes at your university and probably not paying international tuition. And we said, wonderful. You know, it's a good thing. So it's you know, just a couple of examples before I let it go. Thank you.
Do you want to time me, please?
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Carla, and we okay, here's another one right next to me timing me. Oh my gosh, this is too stressful. Okay, but yes, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this, as they said, very important session. And again, I would really reiterate the gratefulness for the First Nations and Métis to allow us to be here. But myself, I would really like to thank the spirits that have allowed us to be here together, and the many generations of peoples that have found this place to be the most beautiful spot in the whole world. Anywhere you go in our homelands, wherever we are as Indigenous peoples, that's exactly what our ancestors have done. They have told us over and over that we are part of the land, and never ever to be in any way, form or shape, to be in a way that you are a human being, you know. So for me, I always have appreciated generations and generations of people that prayed for good life in their nations. So we were asked to do that of thinking about our titles, and I go like, okay, titles in form of what? Yeah. My own title, my first name is Carla, and Carla is actually my cousin, who passed away before my birth, and she lived a very, very short life. And frankly, I'm always cognizant of the fact that I'm actually living her life. So for me, it's a very important one for me to kind of realize that we are mortal ourselves, right? And for me to actually see the world that she would have loved to have seen. I have other 6 names. And again, because of the fact that I was born in Inuit society that really upheld these names, because names are souls, and souls are names, and they go back to the universe once we die. The soul leaves the body and goes back to the universe. So we are connected that way spiritually, and for us these are very important ones to remember. So next one is indeed that I'm mother. I have two beautiful children that are born here in Saskatchewan. They both grew up in Saskatoon, but they're well connected to the Inuit world, and my daughter has moved to Iqaluit when she got her bachelor's degree at University of Calgary in political science, and she has beautiful three children that are my grandchildren. So I'm a grandmother. I'm very proud grandmother because I do invest a lot of knowledge and emotions and God knows what, right, into these kids so that they can keep their language going. And in fact, my grandchildren speak my dialect absolutely beautifully. I just pick up and these white little snotty kids actually speak my language so fluently. And for me, that is just the most important thing in the era of what we call reconciliation, because it is about that of connecting to your own ancestry, to that of connecting to your grandchildren and the futures after us or before us, really. So for me, reconciliation in many ways has to do with that, of the fact that we, in this generation that we are, in this very, very stringent assimilation processes that we have actually undergone on personal level, are the ones that are going to be making connections to our ancestry for those in the future to be able to connect. So that's what I see as my responsibility, as to how connect the my grandmothers in particular, whose lives have been just so trivialized, to that of my grandchildren, so that they don't have to experience this kind of trivialization in their lives. So I am Inuk, and one of the very, very few people that have entered the endangerment of academia, I tell you that much. And there's exceedingly few Inuit scholars. I'm, at this point, the only tenured Inuk professor all across Canada. And I know of another person who is tenured in Alaska, and I know my predecessor is, he's 90 years old, who was also tenured at University of Copenhagen. So there's exceedingly few of us, rare species, I would say. But in form of reconciliation, what I would say is that reconciliation, truth and reconciliation here in Canada has sparked interest, and internationally, the work has been done really, really well, and recommendations are very, very strong. Insofar that where I came from in Greenland, there was indeed a reconciliation in Greenland. It just finished last in December, and I was partaking in that. Greenland was a colony actually when Norway and Denmark were a kingdom together, and many of the people that moved to Greenland were in fact Norwegians also. So we have a situation that speaks to that. I'm also aware of the fact that Norwegian Sami are entering into the discussions on the reconciliation. So the work that has been done here in Canada actually reverberates in many other nations, and it's inspiring. And but the take on is a very different one. But I'll get to University of Saskatchewan later on. My time is off, so.
Thank you. Thank you, Noel, for that prayer this morning. My name is Bob Casius. I'm actually Nukwai from Fishing Lake, Soto from Fishing Lake. It's 2 hours north of here. We're Treaty 4. And, you know, I spent many years not knowing what I wanted to do, right? So I was doing everything but what I should be doing. And then when as a mature student, I went to university. And when I came to university, I actually came to the First Nations University, which was SIFC at the time, Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. And in the first semester, I had a over 90 average because I took SOTO 2 classes. So I aced them really, really good. So and then in the other classes, I can't recall what I took, but you know, and certainly when I came to university, I had two experiences. I had the experience that I encountered with the profs, the teachers, the instructors at SIFC. I also had a different experience when I encountered when I came here in lecture theaters like this, right? So I was in lecture theaters like this, and often just very small minority of Indigenous people in the classrooms. You know, so that experience actually, after I finished my undergrad, I was given an opportunity to pursue a master's degree, and so I decided to do it. And I was asked if I would you know, assist with a non-Indigenous scholar who was really his name was Paul Dudgeon, right? So he's business prof, and so I actually was mentored by him in a really good way. He never tried to speak on behalf of Indigenous communities. But he was an advocate all the time, right? So I actually spent a lot of time with him, and you know, and again in that experience, I had almost no interaction with Indigenous scholars, Indigenous people of any kind. I was in the MBA program with very few of us that were in that program at the time. And I actually went and pursued a PhD in Australia. So Australia is a pretty challenging country if you're an Indigenous person still today, right? So, you know, and for me, when I was asked to have a discussion about this topic, you know, I wanted to, you know, frame the discussion around some of my own experience, but the experiences of the colleagues that I'm in touch with, my colleagues that I'm aware of, and you know, and it goes back to creating, you know, for me, my own experience in school, you know, actually contributes to my pursuit of more Indigenous scholars everywhere, right? First Nations University, I'm the VP academic there, right? Just we have 34 faculty. We have 34 faculty. 50%, 17 of them are status Indians, right? So we have, and one Métis. So we have about 53% of our 34 faculty are Indigenous. The rest are non-Indigenous, right? So, you know, and for me, I'm always, you know what, part of the reason why that is at First Nations University is because of the structure of our systems that are currently in place, right? So for many years, even us, we are told that you had to have a PhD. So we weren't going to hire people unless you had the PhD. Well, how many PhDs in business are there in Canada? Indigenous people. Right? How many in science? Well, we have one over there right now who's got a PhD. There isn't a whole lot, right? There wasn't a whole lot, and so we pushed back, right? So last year I was able to actually, in my role as VP academic, I hired three Indigenous scholars with master's degrees, right? So I was able to get them in, and they're just doing tremendous work, doing really great. And the year before that, we were able to hire one in social work who's now pursuing a PhD. Certainly, for me, the pursuit of more Indigenous scholars goes back to my own experience with the First Nations University. First Nations University is the best example I can think of how best to develop scholars, how best to develop Indigenous scholars. You know, we're owned by Saskatchewan First Nations communities, right? That's the owner of that university. You know, the pursuit of everything that we do there has people like Noel, right? So we pursue post-secondary education based on Indigenous knowledge, with and by and for and you know, and but we also do a lot of Western-based education, right? So social workers learn the social work profession, right? So I went to I teach business, right? So I teach business. I teach how to start businesses. I teach economic development. But it's also, when I start my economic development class, I have somebody like Noel come in and talk about our connection to land, right? And why land is important, especially if you're a business person. So that's the way that we, and for me, when you look at our communities, and it goes back, that's the only reason why I do what I do, right? So and it's because of the challenges that we have still today with Indigenous people. You know, Saskatchewan First Nations, Canadian First Nations, when I did the PhD, it was all over the country. We need to develop so that we can actually engage with the economy in our terms, not on the terms that have been given to us on many times. We need to be able to assist our community so that they can actually, get better. And how do we do that? The primary mechanism is education, right? And for me, when I, in my own experience, and many of the experiences I talk to, we have over 3,000 alumni at First Nations University, and they all speak about the experience they had, about being able to connect with the instructors in the classes, being able to, so that experience actually creates more opportunity for higher retention. We used to have a retention rate over there of 75%, when the U of R's retention overall was about 42, right? So we're at 48 collectively now. But, okay, sorry. So, I think that it's really, really important for us to have people like her right across the country. In my family, post-secondary education was always, I was told by my dad, you always need to pursue it. So I've got a sister who's pursuing a PhD in Edmonton, and another sister who's got a master's in education. My cousin up there has a PhD in education. She's my first cousin. She lived right across the road from me when we grew up, older than her though. So, we actually, I think that, but there's still not enough of us, right? So the only way that we're going to get to, there's more, I have some suggestions, and it might make some people grouchy, but that's the debate that we'll have with, within our academic areas across the country. So, thanks.
All right, so I'll just say something brief about myself as well. I'm Cree Stoney background, so Tansei to my friends out there. I was a long time, 8 years anyway, Senior Director of the Office for Aboriginal Peoples at Simon Fraser University, the office which was responsible for implementing the university's first Aboriginal strategic plan. So I was the first director, so that's what my obituary will say, ladies and gentlemen. First Director, Office for Aboriginal Peoples, Simon Fraser University. But I'm currently a Senior Advisor there on Aboriginal Affairs. Working in these senior roles has been somewhat of a manic experience, if I can put it that way. If you're in a Indigenous leadership role, you know all of the warts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's been an era of tremendous progress on Indigenous initiatives at Simon Fraser University. In fact, in 2010, my first annual report was 4 pages long. Within 6 years, it was up to about 50 pages, just to show what was sort of happening from an Indigenous perspective at SFU. So there was a lot of success there, and it was very much a team effort on the part of Indigenous peoples and allies that were working there. But there were certainly some hiccups along the way, sources of tremendous frustration. But from a big picture perspective, it hasn't been too bad. And with regards to reconciliation specifically, SFU went through this process of officially wanting to answer the TRC calls to action as an institution, and we went through a year of talking with the community off campus and on, and came up with Aboriginal Reconciliation Council final report, which is a step-by-step answer to the TRC calls to action. So as a university, we've done pretty well at walking the walk with response to the TRC. So it's been quite thrilling in that respect. But as I said, it's been this manic experience. you know, I could sit up, I could write a book. Well, I'm writing a PhD about all of this stuff, right? So I'm writing a book about it, so, so it's coming down the pike. But it has been a wonderful journey, and, you know, I was the first one in my family not to have to go to residential school. So that in itself, I guess, was a blessing. But that's all in my background, and the spillover of that certainly spilled over into my and my brother's generations for sure. So, so my family's experience with education overall in this country has been a manic experience, if you will. It saved me and my brothers in many respects, but it also, you know, hurt members of my family. And I'm sure a lot of us up here can speak to those kinds of comments as well. But it's been a great journey, and we certainly have a lot to talk about today. We touched on some of it already, so maybe we'll get into some of the questions here then. And there'll be some overlap, like for each of the questions I wrote down a whole bunch of points. I'll go last, so I'll cross them off as we go along, and we probably have 2 or 3 minutes for each one, so if we'd like to kind of do it in point form, because we have about 6 major questions to consider. So could we put the first question up there? So question number 1, why is there a need to recruit and retain Indigenous faculty members? And could you just put the next slide up? It's on the TRC calls to action. So Marie Wilson, TRC commissioner, who actually was here this week, she has publicly stated that this is how universities as a whole can respond to the TRC calls to action. And there's the points up here and what the points call for. And we won't read through them all because of the time factor, but you can quickly have a look-see. And you can tell that to do what's being called for by the TRC and Marie Wilson is going to require Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous faculty members, to do a lot of this work. So if you're referring back to reconciliation, TRC calls to action, this is the call in this country right now. This is a call by Marie Wilson and others to do this work that she mentions up here as examples. And we're going to need Indigenous faculty members to do this and to take the lead at it. So could you just go back to the first question here? Up there? So question number 1, why is there a need to recruit and retain Indigenous faculty members? So why is there the need? So let us go down the table again and consider this question.
If I may. So I mentioned being here on behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and in my time there, since I began my secondment, I've come to understand and believe in my heart of hearts that reconciliation is not something that we as a nation of Canada are doing for Indigenous people. In fact, it is a gift that was given to this nation by Indigenous people. So when residential school survivors came together as communities in 2005 to hold the government of Canada to account for that history through the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, we as a nation were given a gift to heal ourselves from some of our darkest chapters. And so I want to frame my conversation in that way, that reconciliation is an opportunity for Canada and the institutions that maintain this nation to heal themselves and not the other way around. So we could look at this from a perspective that this is something that we're doing for Indigenous faculty members to better their lives and create opportunity, but I think that's only one part of the story. I think the other part of the story is that this is absolutely necessary for the longevity and well-being of institutions to reach their full potential, to be what they were meant to be in terms of institutes of higher learning in the nation of Canada. And so we could take a look at this from the most cynical perspective and say that it's simply going to be economical. If we're going to be competitive as institutions, if we're going to maintain enrollment in a changing political, social, economic climate, it's going to be necessary to have Indigenous representation inside of your faculty member to maintain vibrancy. But I would take it a little bit further and maybe think a little bit more abstractly. If we are going to achieve our full potential, and if we are going to help heal this nation and take advantage of this gift that's been given to us, this opportunity, then there's a desperate need for Canadian institutions like post-secondaries to really get moving very, very quickly. I'll go back to the case point in this case study of the pipelines and the decision that was made today. Last year, I went to one of the knowledge keepers in Manitoba, a fellow by the name of Dave Corshane, and I was talking to him about the question of divestment that many students have been calling on universities to make, to divest their monies from anything to do with oil or pipelines. And the message that I got from this elder in Manitoba was that it wouldn't be his place as an elder, as a knowledge keeper, to encourage young people to protest pipelines or to not protest pipelines, but instead to provide the kind of education where young people could grow up to be the kind of people where it isn't necessary to have those damn pipelines to begin with. The question that, it's either a question of economic growth or no pipelines is completely absurd. We know that there is a way to live in balance and harmony with Mother Nature, and be vibrant as a community. And I think that by engaging with Indigenous knowledges, not just as a token gesture, but by the very kind of framework that my colleague is offering, where we're actually honoring traditional knowledge as being equal to, we have an opportunity to perhaps save this planet for our children. I think that's why it's so important.
Thank you. From my perspective and from our institutional perspective, we've got a huge responsibility as universities. And I see, and we talk about this a lot at our institution, education is the key to social change and sustainable prosperity for everybody in this country. Now, when we look at that as a values-based institution, we've got to recognize that the values that we have as an institution, some of them are respect, are diversity, and indeed in terms of building the knowledge base and the ways of knowing within the institution, we can't just continue on a Western dialogue. If we do, we're fooling ourselves in terms of the incredible knowledge that exists in this country. So we have to develop two-way learnings, mutual respect, and create the environments where indeed that can happen. And indeed, you provide the opportunity for the knowledge that exists and has for hundreds and thousands of years within these regions and these communities that we've been welcomed into. So the second thing is we think about that. When we think about the overrepresentation in the population of certain folks, think of the populations in foster care. BC, 4% of the population, Aboriginal. 64% of the kids in foster care are Aboriginal. Why? Direct relationship to the intergenerational impact of the residential schools. Can we, within the university, provide the kind of learning and supportive environment by not including all the cultures in the province, in the region, to be able to support these kids who have lived a life of abundance in terms of their family love and the care they're getting at home. But coming into this strange institution, what are we doing to support that? And how do we provide the people who can understand and speak that dialogue? Transition to post-secondary education. Numbers are awful. Poverty and the multi-dimensions of poverty, not just dollars and cents, but the multi-dimensions of poverty. And then there's underrepresentation in the judiciary, underrepresentation in senior administration at universities, underrepresentation in faculty. So because of that, we've got a lot of work to do. How do we create the space? So you grow your own, as we talked about here a little bit, and you provide supports, great mechanisms. The Federation, how do we develop more scholarships? How do we develop more pathways? How do we ensure that the knowledge is recognized and respected, not just for the anthropologist that grabs that knowledge and goes on to become a member of the Royal Society because they've garnered the knowledge from the elders, but actually respecting the elders for the knowledge that they have and holding them up and saying, let's celebrate this for that reason. And we've got to break some of those dialogues in the way that they work. The other thing is feeding the forces of inclusion and starving the forces of exclusion. Think about that for a minute. What are you doing on your campus to feed the forces of inclusion? And how does that look relative to getting faculty members in? So listening and listening again. Building a narrative of how you're going to include and how you're going to change, how you're going to understand. Creating ceremony, creating spaces for engagement, bringing all that into the institution where the people can see themselves, the communities can see themselves in the institution. Not this old archaic Western structure, but a wonderful, rich environment that's being created that. And so bringing faculty in will help create those dialogues, and indeed creating the space will welcome those faculty in so that they can indeed grow and be strong within that environment. Union leadership, making sure that your unions are strong on it, and making sure that they're focused on how do we pay attention to this and how do we address this. So training, education, and exclusion, and starving the forces of exclusion. Many of the young people that want to go on to do their PhDs or want to go on and work in the university, they're excluded because they don't have pathways to be able to get support. They're excluded because there isn't clear and recognized support. It's growing, but it's not as good as it needs to be. And of course, going after the public policy in this country at a federal level, going after it at a provincial level, and indeed going after it within the institutions. Again, that's a place where so much of the exclusionary action in this country is, and that will get at helping us be able to bring faculty into the institutions and be able to support them and allow them to continue to grow. And we can't just let this happen by chance. We have to take extraordinary measures and extraordinary action to foster that change. It's not good enough just to talk. It's got to be the action. It's got to be the real action that makes the change. And that's what's going to do it. And I'll just give one example of where we took after foster kids in our province, because we know some of those incredible foster kids. At 18, they're cut off. 4% of the population Aboriginal, 64%. Remember, we just opened our doors and said, every kid that's been in foster care, free tuition at our institution. And then we started looking at how do we get all of the kids supported, because there's so many other things you have to deal with. And after 5 years, we went after all the other schools. We got 11 of the 25 doing it. And then we went to and got the provincial government to sign off this September 1st. So every school in the province now provides free tuition for kids that age out of care. So that means we've got a mechanism to get more kids into school, more kids supported, and more kids through, so we can get more into the pipeline that then can come back and help us at our institutions grow ourselves out of this problem. But we've got to be extraordinary in building our own and providing spaces earlier on than we might to ensure that they have that place to grow. Thank you.
Thank you for incredible amount of articulation before me. The two of them are just really, wow, fantastic in their articulations. I feel a little bit intimidated. Plus the fact that I'm the only female in this panel. I've just been kind of like, I was thinking maybe I shouldn't go, but this morning I go, the only female, better go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I went. But what I wanted to address, thank you for your words, and these are really very, very good in form of thinking and doing that. Of course, I've been thinking about that too. So why do we need the faculty members? In the College of Education, specifically within the Ed Foundations, there has indeed been a policy to actually hire Indigenous scholars from early on, and that's in many ways is because of the fact that in the College of Education there used to be Indian Northern Education program that was closed down and became part of the Educational Foundation. So I'm very happy to see that that policy has taken place in form of the fact that we have incredible knowledge holders within the Educational Foundations. We have Maggie here. So Maggie Kovac, we have Marie Baptiste, we have Verna Saint-Denis, Alex Wilson, and little old me. That's what we have. And frankly, it's been a very, very incredible push forward and upwards in terms of the knowledge that is delivered within the university. For us to be the knowledge holders and that are producers of the Indigenous knowledge within universities. I do see that universities have responsibilities to enlarge and enhance the ways of thinking. And frankly, within the last 100 years or so, there's been such an evolution of assimilation all across the world that at this point we have highly trained, highly focused individuals that are experts. They do not see the world around them. Frankly, from the point of view of holistic ways of knowing, we do produce individuals that do not have spirits. They do not have souls. They do not have the heart. They are just physical beings that really do not know how to relate to other people. They do not know how to relate to the land. And for my purposes, that's exactly what it is. We are providing the institutions with incredible amount of knowledge from our communities that speaks to the love of the land, that speaks to the love of the people next to you, that speaks to the love of animals around us, and that we be able to perpetuate these in more millennia. And for me, that is a very, very, very important one for me to be able to indicate to the students in my classes that at this point in these systems of knowledge, we are producing 1/4 human beings, partial human beings, mechanical human beings that really do not know how to react. And in that, we are indeed breeding racism, we are breeding inequality, we are, frankly, environment is like secondary to that kind of knowledge system. And that, to me, is a very, very dangerous road to do. So here we are in a situation where we as Indigenous people have to go against the grain in that situation. And it's harsh. It's really, really harsh. And the blunt, see my gray hair? But there you go, right? It's so blunt. Our colleagues on the corridors, the students, you name it. It's very, very blunt. And racism is very, very incredible to those of us that are coming from our communities looking like we are and speaking like we are. Undermining of the thoughts is just unsurmountable. That's what it is. So for that to be handled in a meaningful way, I think that many more universities should be engaged in the area of how do we go about knowledge systems that are multi ways of knowing, diverse ways of knowing, and particularly holistic ways of knowing from which we come from. And that's what I would like to see in the future. And that's why you need Indigenous faculty members that can articulate that.
You made it harder for me after all you guys there. So I won't speak for too long. I think that I just want to make one point, and that's in respect to the pursuit of indigenization across the country by many of the mainstream institutions, post-secondary institutions. It's occurring in many different ways across the country. And for me, I think that the best way to inform that pursuit is actually having people embedded within your institution, having scholars right within your institution who are working with the administration, working with faculties, working with everybody, and engaging really as closely as possible with that pursuit. I've seen a number of institutions who've one case where a business school they actually decided that they would incorporate some level of Indigenous content into all their courses, using primarily case studies, right? So if you're an accountant and you're teaching accountancy, well, if you could get a case study that involves some Indigenous content, then you get a little check mark, right? So there's many challenges with that type of pursuit. I think that the best way to deal with that type of thing is if you have any one of the Indigenous scholars that we have in Canada who can actually argue, hey, you know what, that's probably not the best way to do it, right? There's probably other ways we can pursue what it is that we're trying to achieve here. So for me, I think that there isn't a whole lot. I meant that it was mentioned before. You can do, in 6 years ago, the Stats Canada reported that 0.9% of all the members across the country, university faculties, were Indigenous, right? So 0.9. That's a low percentage, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to do more, and recruiting and retention of people there's many challenges, and I could speak to them in one of the following questions, but I think that there's still a great deal of work. Ralph's comments about these Western institutions and trying to nudge them to change is going to be one of the harder challenges that we have to face, I think.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, sharing the mics here, folks. So my comments, I'll make them point form and then get into one in a little more in depth, but this is based on my past almost 9 years at Simon Fraser University now. Without Indigenous faculty members, you can't properly indigenize an institution. That's pretty basic, right? So you need Indigenous people to do that if you want to indigenize your institution, particularly if you want to indigenize programs and courses and work with Indigenous graduate students. You need Indigenous people to do that. You have to. You just have to. To build better connections to Indigenous community. Some of our settler ally friends have been very helpful in that regard and have made those connections. But it is Indigenous people themselves who make the best connections to Indigenous communities. As well, the workload of Indigenous faculty is extremely heavy. From what I've heard from among some of our Indigenous faculty members, and I've talked to them about this, they carry a heavier workload than most other faculty members. There's Indigenous graduate students to be mentored. Some Indigenous graduate students can't get an Indigenous professor to sit on their committee. And the reason is the Indigenous faculty members are already way overworked looking after so many other Indigenous graduate students. They're asked to do everything. So death by 1,000 committees, that's what I say, right? I know because I was asked to sit on every committee imaginable. So our Indigenous faculty members are being asked as well. And the heavier service-related aspects of their job, they're asked to sit on boards and be involved in community initiatives more than other people because of their role and the status they've attained. And this even in faculties where there are numerous Indigenous scholars. So an Indigenous scholar surprisingly said this to me, yes, the workload is so heavy, I don't know how I'm managing it, in a faculty where there were half a dozen Indigenous scholars. So imagine if you're one. So these are some very basic reasons why you need Indigenous people. And finally, settler allies are helpful, but not always. They don't always want to defer to Indigenous peoples. When Indigenous peoples finally get into these jobs, you spoke of an ally who wouldn't speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples. You knew somebody and were mentored by somebody. Well, there are still people out there who do. They do want to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples, even though they're not Indigenous and there's Indigenous people there sitting at the table. And that can cause some really uncomfortable situations I've seen. And even destructive situations. I've seen those who, when they were in positions of power, make decisions that really hurt a lot of Aboriginal people within an institution, hurt the reputation of the institution because of what they did. And yet they would sit there and argue that they were our ally. They would sit there and say that, I know, because I've seen it and experienced it. So this is part of the need to recruit and retain Indigenous faculty members as well, is to sort of combat that sort of aspect of pressure that is there by those who perhaps need to learn to defer a little bit and to step aside in some cases. So I know we're you asked us to speak of some controversial aspects of this endeavor that we're talking about today, so there's one I'm just kind of throwing out there, so without trying to offend anybody in the room. Okay, let's move on to question number 2 then. So how do we, that is institutions and society at large, understand Indigenous perspectives, knowledges, and peoples thriving in post-secondary education? So I think with some of our comments we've been touching on this. How do we understand Indigenous peoples thriving in post-secondary education? Considering the different needs and approaches of Indigenous peoples themselves. So we'll go down the table and see what our colleagues have to say about this.
Sure. So I'm loath to speak for it. Actually, before I answer that, I have to make a confession. I, too, was sitting here feeling intimidated. I was like, holy smokes, listen to these people talk. And then you shared that you were feeling intimidated, and I thought, oh, geez, well, you know what, maybe I'll try to set aside my ego and just speak from the heart here, because apparently we're all in the same boat. But I'm loath to speak on behalf of somebody else and sort of make a suggestion that I know what other people are thinking or feeling or how they're understanding something. But I will offer this. One of the best definitions of culture that I ever heard was given to me by a fellow named Martin Brokenlake, an Indigenous scholar in education, who said that culture is very simply that which seems normal to us. And I've actually had people who have studied culture, you know, and they perk up whenever I talk about culture and they want to argue it, but it's so simple without being simplistic. There really isn't an argument. Culture is that which seems normal to us. And if we consider culture in Canada from that perspective, what seems normal to us, There's certain things perhaps that we can come to understand that have been normalized in Canada. And I think it's from a cultural perspective that we understand this worldview, this epistemology of other. And I think a lot of times our understandings of that other are filtered through our cultural understandings, through our sense of what is normal or what is to be expected. Now, when I talk about culture, it's important to me from a reconciliatory lens to state very quickly that if we're not Indigenous, if we're a non-Indigenous person, your perspective is no less important than anyone else's. This isn't a value statement saying that a perspective is right or wrong. It simply is. But what we're talking about here is the opportunity to negotiate a space where my perspective can sit on equal playing field or equal importance to your perspective, and we can have a conversation and maybe begin to learn from one another. And so I think that what's happening in a lot of institutions, and working at the NCTR, I have the opportunity to see sort of a bird's eye view of what's going on across the country. And what I'm seeing is a lot of people having to negotiate business as usual from this perspective of trying to make space for something else. And the tendency for that is oftentimes to filter indigeneity through this lens of a Western construct or through a Western system. Now, I don't want to suggest that there's anything wrong with Western education. Western education has offered many people an opportunity to contribute to the betterment of humanity. This isn't a throw the baby out with a bathwater statement, or it isn't to suggest that universities are bad. I am aware, keenly aware, that universities in Canada have been complicit with the exercise of colonization. I am keenly aware that knowledge is gained in institutions like this have been used as a weapon against Indigenous people. But I'm not suggesting that Western education in and of itself is evil or wrong. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I think there's something really, really inspiring and something really sort of encouraging if we ponder on the wisdom of the treaty acknowledgement that we started with. That Canada is the story of a coming together. That Canada is in and itself an example of what is possible when we take the best of both worlds and try to make something better. And so we've inherited from the Western world many, many ideas about how to live our lives, and we've offered to our children answers to life's questions based upon those perspectives. But if we are to allow a Canadian university to reach its full potential, then we should go back to that idea of a coming together. And that in creating space where Indigenous worldviews don't have to be filtered through a Western perspective, but instead sit in a place of equal presence, equal relationship, of reciprocity, that the knowledge that's gained here will allow people to transcend that mechanization that was talked about in Kianami for that perspective, that idea of providing our children and our grandchildren with a more holistic education, where stepping out of a Canadian Institute of Higher Learning includes reconciliation with the living world, reconciliation with self, and acknowledgement of self as a full human being. It is actually something really, really beautiful. So I would encourage you to be fearless in this exercise of maybe creating a space to open the halls of academia to this other worldview, and to understand that there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that everything that you've done in your career comes from a perspective. There's nothing wrong with that. It's empowering to recognize that, and to acknowledge that our perspective is not the only one that has place or purchase in a healthy, vibrant Canadian society.
Thank you, Kevin. So on this question, you know, we can get into some real big and important questions here about this question in terms of Indigenous perspectives, knowledge, and people thriving in post-secondary education. Our institutions have to recognize their responsibility in the context of creating the culture within the institutions. And the culture within the institutions is where we need to provide the supports. And most institutions rarely go back and scrape back to what are the values of this institution and where are we. I was very, very fortunate that I learned and spent a lot of time with a fellow here in Saskatchewan that I brought into a center that we were developing here called the Indigenous Peoples Health Research Center back in the early 90s. And we got a lot of money. But it was money that we were going to invest in community in Saskatchewan. And we did. We invested over $1 million a year in supporting capacity building for Indigenous scholars, Indigenous PhD, master's, undergraduate students from around all the nations within Saskatchewan. And I learned a lot. But Willie was along on this and really helped me understand, because he had done a lot of work thinking about the two different cultures and thinking about the Indigenous knowledge and the different ways of knowing, and then Western knowledge and the different ways of knowing. And had very, very good dialogues with me about the space in between these two. And he called this space of dialogue. It's a space of dialogue, this ethical space, he called it. And until you reach that place where you develop the two-way mutual respect with reciprocity in terms of the dialogues that you have, you're not going to be able to create the kind of space that's necessary to move forward together. Because you have to move forward together in this. Because there is indeed these institutions that have been around for thousands of years, going to continue to be around. But we know they have to evolve, we know they have to adjust, we know they have to change. And it's through understanding the responsibility of people within the institutions. The most important relationship at our university is the relationship between the faculty member and the student. That's where the learning goes on. It's not the president's relationship with the premier. It's not the president's relationship with a donor. I've got to go find money, but only so I can support that most important relationship. And that's a relationship between the faculty member and the student, in the lab, in the classroom, in those field engagements, whatever that might be. And unless we've got Indigenous faculty members involved in that most important relationship, we're not creating a real learning environment that Canada needs to represent. And so within our institutions, we have to think about the spaces that we create. What are we doing where the people can come from the communities and recognize themselves? So I have conversations with the communities every week, every month, every year, and constant conversations. Help us understand, what do we need to do? How do we need to change? Because you are who we're representing in these dialogues. And a lot of this work in reconciliation, the communities are telling us, Ralph, you know, we're not ready to reconcile on some of this stuff. It's all well and good. We've got this beautiful report. But for God's sakes, there's a lot of pain in my community. There's a lot of pain there. And young students come up to me, and I'll go and do a soup and bannock talk that we do every Tuesday at noon. And in the conversation, well, I'll hear from these students and say, Ralph, or Mr. President, you know, I learned about all this stuff, and I went home and talked to my grandparents about it. They never told me these stories. Now we're opening up this dialogue in my family that we haven't had. So whose responsibility is it to support people? Because we as a university opened up the dialogue. Because we were thinking reconciliation, good thing, let's have these conversations. And the communities were saying, yes, very, very important we have these conversations. But all of a sudden we've got a whole other series of dialogues that are happening. And whose responsibility is that? Is it the faculty member? Is a faculty member prepared to deal with that? Especially if they come from a settler background where they've got no experience? So that's why we need to create the space and the place and the strength of capacity within the institution to be able to address many of these dialogues. Because it's very, very difficult for somebody like myself to really get into that dialogue. I can understand it intellectually, but I certainly can't understand it on the ground. And I certainly can't understand the lived experience. But how do I create the space? How do I find the money? How to find the other support systems to ensure that we're creating the space within this place of two-way mutual respect, of reciprocity, where that in dialogue can take place. And that's the responsibility of a university administrator, and that's the responsibility of a university not only within the institution, but in all the communities we serve. Because unless the communities, you know, these highly recognized institutions within our communities, unless they are taking on these difficult dialogues in our community, then they are not living up to their responsibility. Whether it's Simon Fraser, whether it's Winnipeg, whether it's VIU, whether it's U of S, whether it's First Nations University. Where is the reach out in community and making sure these dialogues are happening to move it beyond just the internal aspects of the institution? Thank you.
Okay, so institutions and society at large. My understanding of some of the material coming from the Truth and Reconciliation is the fact that the notions of negotiating things from nation to nation. And because as Indigenous groups, we are indeed nations. But we've been caught into this nation building of nations. So here in Canada, of course, it's been the Brits and from France. So we have a large, 30 million people here in Canada that have actually bought into doing away with their own languages, their own cultures. And in the institutions, higher institutions at universities, we do receive students that have actually no knowledge on where they came from. They have no idea how to pronounce their surnames from which they come from, and it's like just totally whitewashed. I find that very, very troublesome, particularly as an Indigenous person, that we go by having to know where we are coming from. And so we are finger pointed in that whitewashed situation where we become the agitators. We become the notable in that regard. We become the strangers and whatnot, become the other, being other that way. So I think that in many ways the universities has a responsibility to actually do that, of figuring a way out to see how these individuals coming into university, they come with their own culture. You know, I have students in the College of Education that say, I have no culture. I don't know where I come from. I have no culture. I like burger. Okay, so I like seal. So where the heck do we meet, right? It's like unbelievable. I come back home and I go like, how do I then, in sort of anti-racist education or whatever, actually reach to their mindset in a way that, you know, the blindfolding becomes like out. The DC color. To me, that's a very, very difficult one to kind of get across. And that's the privilege. That's the white privilege, is that they are totally blinded to become like a Canadian citizen and be subjugated into that, becoming a member of the Canadian society. So I think many more things can be addressed towards that, rather than addressing towards us as Indigenous peoples. So that's, to me, is the biggest problem, as to how to impress upon the students to see who they are. Well, that goes right up. I purposefully put this on because I've been in the CERC and CIHR and NSERC committees evaluating research things. And notice the fact that CERC is celebrating 40 years. 40 years of what? Of becoming assimilated into being a Canadian, right? And that's exactly what all the granting councils have done. So busy about, you know, excellence in Canada and whatnot. In the Arctic, we have a lot of research projects that have been spending millions of dollars to do that, of taking knowledge into the universities and virtually absolutely nothing going back to the communities. And in form of language, in form of knowledge translation, even though the fact that these granting councils have been trying to do that, of addressing the knowledge translation. I don't really see anything in Inuktitut. I don't really see the way in which that the Inuit can be using this new knowledge in their ways of enhancing their oral traditions, in ways of enhancing their own language, in form of ownership of the land and doing things. I don't necessarily see that. So I think that we have a lot of things to do as to who supports these knowledge systems. I've just been to an NSERC President's committee that's now looking into how to deal with situation where in Aboriginal communities there is virtually nothing as far as the natural sciences are concerned from the communities. How do they go about reaching out to the communities in a way that train engineers and architects and natural scientists in that regard? Oh my gosh, it's like millions of years of gap, right? Just about. And here we are just 40 years, right? So it's like everything coming in a huge vacuum like that, gap of knowledge. It's tremendous pressure in that regard. So anyways, last week I was in Arctic, G7 summit and happened to be on the Arctic research. Okay, we have Germans, we have European countries, the UK coming into, United States coming into the Arctic regions to do the research. Multi-million-dollar boats coming in and using ice flow to do their research and have absolutely no connections to the rights of the Aboriginal peoples one way or the other. One came over to me and started talking to me, a Brit. You know, I was married to a Brit, so I kind of know the psyche here. Very nice guy. But anyway, so the guy comes, we really do want to do research in the far north, in the far Arctic regions. I said, oh yeah, nice. Please do come. But if you're going to be seeing us as human beings equal to you, you need to open the doors for Inuit to be able to sell the sealskins in the UK. You have no idea the kind of face that I have received on that one there. He was absolutely incredulous. And yet, the sealskin ban is the highest oppressor that causes the Inuit the poverty that we have all across the Arctic. Alaska, Canada, Greenland. And he goes like, no Brit will ever accept that. And I said, that's really your problem because of the fact I do know that your science, as a Western science, will prove that no seal is endangered. And I would also tell you that Inuit science would tell you exactly the same. So you're operating your policies, national policies, based on uneducated knowledge. That's what it is. So we have a huge work to do. And what I wanted to say in this one here, the work that we do in universities as academic and whatnot has to come back home to individuals that are really, really suffering. So you may see me as a privileged professor, but in my heart, that's what this is about. It's about giving back to the communities and making sure that our own community members can live a life in their own dignity. That's what that is about.
You know, in many ways, many of our Indigenous communities are still developing our understanding of ourselves. Right, we're still working on that. For many years, there's been all kinds of challenges that have existed for us. You know, and I speaking with Willie Ermine, him and I had a conversation recently about so why is it that our knowledge why can't it be shared, right? So why can't it be shared? Why can't we have more discussions about that? Because we often hear people saying, "Oh no, you can't share that. You can't do this." And so you know, and he actually said that in some ways, some of that's related to the practices back when our spirituality and cultural practices were banned legally. You know, and we had a discussion about a Soto man who said that he doesn't sweat with women. He doesn't sweat with women, and so we actually tried to dig into why that was. Right. Well, you know, we discovered that in his community back in the day, the men would leave the woman with the family and protect them and take care of the home, take care of the kids, and if we go to jail, that's fine, right? We're going to go and do ceremony in the bush, in the trees, away from our woman, you know. And so we still have a lot of development ourselves, right? So we still have a lot to work on ourselves as Indigenous people. We've just went through a whole range of challenges, and we're coming into institutions that have just as much challenge as we do. You know, I recently read a book about I have the citation, and if anybody wants it, but he actually made a comment about how in 1972, when he was an undergrad student at the U of T, the textbook that he was given on Canadian history, and he actually quoted chapter 1. And in chapter 1, they talked about Indigenous people, and they talked about us as being, you know, these savages that had no governance, we had no. So the taking over of our land was okay because we actually never organized ourselves in any structured way, right? That we didn't have any kinds of. So it was all fine. That's 1972, right? Being taught at a university. Certainly, there's still many examples of situations where we hear stereotypical beliefs about us. So, you know, when we're talking about Indigenous perspectives, you know, there's a survey that was done, and in the survey they were asking, it was actually went to primary students, and in the question, or it could have been high school students, and in the question it actually said something about Indian people as alcoholics, right? It was like, it's like, I don't know if that's anyways, many challenges still exist with the way we're perceived, right? There's still many challenges with the way Indigenous people are perceived. And then, you know what, in some cases, many of us don't, there's many of our Indigenous people who are struggling in really significant ways with their indigeneity. They don't have that cultural background. They didn't get to be able to go through the nurturing that should have occurred as kids. They didn't get to experience that, right? So they've now, as adults, trying to figure out, so who am I and what am I, right? So, and those discussions, I think, when we're talking about post-secondary education, I think when we have those discussions, that's why it's so important to have, to recruit and retain Indigenous people so they can have those discussions, so that they can actually really start understanding who they are. I was part of a research project where I was part of it simply because I was able to write grants. And it was for a tribal council, and we got money to actually examine culture and healing. And so we asked, there's over 30, we had over 30 clients of an Indigenous healing center. They're getting counseling and therapy, and we asked them, like, so why do you come here? What's the benefit? And they all talked about this cultural identity, and how without that they were never, and so for us, when we're talking about that issue in particular, it's really important for structurally across the country to recognize that those spaces are best done, and I'm saying this in as a respectful way as possible. Those spaces are, I think, the best spaces that you find are the ones that our people feel safe, that they can actually learn, and there's spaces like that all across the country. Some of them are in big institutions. UBC's Log House is a good example, right? University of Saskatchewan has the new center there, But in institutions like ours, the whole institution is that space. First Nations University for 40 years has been creating that space, and here's the challenge, is that when we're talking about what to do in Canada, there's a big issue that we're dealing with right now. There's probably I don't know what the total number is. There's a whole bunch of colleges that were created by Indigenous communities. They're right across the country, right? So and many of these. So in 2014, the federal government decided, we need to open up. All our mainstream institutions are going through a process of indigenization. We applaud that, and we need to support them, right? So let's open up all the funding that we have to these primarily Indigenous institutions. Let's open it up to everybody. So now UBC gets it, U of T gets it. And what happened to our smaller Indigenous institutions? They started they're on the verge of collapse, right? So if we're going to talk about how do we actually support this type of thing, how do we support Indigenous control, we need to look at the federal government and say, hey, what are you guys doing here, right? Put some more money to it, do something, but don't stop, helping the institutions that I think are really important to us in Canada. Thanks.
Sorry. So I'm working? Okay, good. So I'll just mention a couple things about Indigenous perspectives, knowledges, and people's thriving in post-secondary education. And I just wrote something down here. When you see it and feel it, you know what's happening, basically, right? So when you see an institution that has Indigenous people working there as elders, as staff, as administrators, as faculty members, when you see those community connections, when you see indigenized curriculum happening across the board, when you see Indigenous representation through art, architecture, convocation, and student spaces creation, and when you see those student numbers there, then you know that Aboriginal people, their knowledges, their perspectives are thriving in post-secondary education. So when you see it and feel it, you know what's happening. So I'm cognizant of the time, so what we're going to do is combine the next couple of questions here. Maybe we could just put the questions as a whole up there. So question 3, what has been done by your institution regarding the recruiting and retaining of Indigenous faculty members? So what have you done? And then if we could just put question 4, what challenges have been encountered, systemic and others, particularly barriers regarding the hiring of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across institutions. So what has been done, and what challenges do you face? So however you'd like to answer that, being a little cognizant of the time.
Okay. All right. You know, I just want to speak to what Bob left off on about this idea of who benefits from these efforts at reconciliation. It's something that strikes near and dear to my heart. And he was talking about the experience of Indigenous places of learning competing with larger institutions that are now getting the funding. You may, if you've been following the news, may have heard with the recent federal budget that the NCTR from the federal government is receiving $7 million over 7 years, and a non-Indigenous organization that will remain unnamed, unless you know what I'm talking about, received for 1 year $5 million. So a non-Indigenous organization for 1 year gets $5 million, and the NCTR, which carries on the work of the TRC, about $1 million a year to operate. And that includes maintaining the archives, which we've been called upon to learn from. And one of the things that I'm going to say very quickly about that, why that I bring that up, isn't just to be petty about that, although it's a little bit about being petty, but it's not just about being petty, is that I'm going to ask each and every one of you personally to be aware of what's going on with the IAP process, the Individual Assessment Program, and the destruction of records. Very recently, the Supreme Court of Canada decided that the records collected through the IAP process of the Truth and Reconciliation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. These are the records that were collected from survivors who had been abused physically, sexually, emotionally, who went through a separate process from the Common Experience Program. The Supreme Court of Canada has decided that those records should be destroyed. The perspective of the NCTR is that that's a horrible thing, that that's a huge victory for the offenders. And we're not exactly sure yet. The court still has to make a final decision on how we can reach out to survivors and let them know that they can opt into having those records saved at the NCTR. If they don't opt in, those records are to be destroyed. If they've passed away, those records are already been destroyed, which it counts now for thousands of stories of people who have experienced abuse in residential schools. Their records, without their consent, were destroyed because of the Supreme Court's decision. I'm going to need each and every one of you in every aspect of work that you do to be a part of the exercise of reaching out to survivors to let them know that they have a right to have their records preserved if they choose. If we don't get that message to them, they're not going to know that they have that opportunity. Those records are going to be destroyed. Now that's important to us because, again, a non-Indigenous organization that's working on creating spaces in Western institutions based upon the name of a rock star who would not have wanted the money to be spent that way is receiving $5 million for 1 year. Well, we got $1 million per year to be able to do this work, and fighting with the Supreme Court of Canada to be able to do so. So I'm going to ask each and every one of you to be aware of that, because I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to reach out to your institutions and say, will you be a part of helping us reach out to the survivors so that they know the story? Leaving that aside, and I wanted to make sure that I had a chance to say that in terms of what has been done, it's very, very different from U15 institutions to the smaller institutions. Right now, the NCTR is housed at the U of Manitoba, which is a U15 institution, has different sort of approaches to reaching out to faculty members. But really what it comes down to for me is safety. When I applied for the position of Associate Vice President, Indigenous Affairs, I knew that the U of W had already committed to indigenization as one of their strategic directions. The problem I had with that is that I don't know what indigenization means, which is a problem if you're going to be the administrative lead of that. And so I reached out to people that I trust, people who are knowledge keepers, names you would recognize, and I said, what is this thing that we're committed to? I mean, I get it, it's a Western concept, it's a verb, we're trying to accomplish something. But in terms of real practice, what does this mean, especially for Indigenous students? And the answer I got back from everyone I spoke to, and I'm going to share this with you, was that whatever indigenization means, it has to involve safety. It's about safety. Now, I want to be very clear on what I mean when I say safety. I'm not talking about the kind of safety where we avoid conversations that make us feel uncomfortable. That's not what I'm talking about. In fact, reconciliation is going to necessitate conversations that do make us uncomfortable. But safety means a lot more than that. It means not just the physical safety of our students, which is the damn bare minimum, which isn't guaranteed. And the stories of 1,200 missing and murdered women who should be at home with their families tonight will attest to the fact that Canada is not safe for Indigenous people. But it also includes the safety of cultural identity, to be able to be visibly Indigenous on campus and not feel the burden of representation. Safety of cultural expression, which includes smudging. And I believe that smudging should be allowed in every institution in Canada. In fact, there's nothing more Canadian than smudging, considering the fact that treaty was negotiated over campfire after smudging and pipe. But it's also one of those things where we acknowledge that education was the main weapon used against cultural practice of Indigenous people, and so institutions like U of R need to be able to allow for smudging to take place as part of that safety of expression, which includes public schools, and it's something that I feel very, very strongly about. It's also safety of grief, and my friend Ralph very eloquently and appropriately talked about the fact that for many Indigenous students, they're going to learn about why things are the way that they are in an institution like this. And I remember personally being at the U of W and needing to go and find a place just to simply go and cry after a class, because I finally understood why there was so much, why my family wasn't able to love me the way that I felt that I needed. Okay? And so I would encourage you to think about this in terms of safety, that whatever this is, it has to be about the safety of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous students, and this relationship that we're trying to take care of. Now, I could talk about specific things. We also have a program for kids in care that they don't pay tuition. One of the things I'm very proud of is that we raised in front of our campus a Two-Spirited flag, which honors the contributions of the Two-Spirited community in Manitoba. And of course, homophobia is something that was completely foreign to at least Anishinaabe cultures. It was something that was imposed upon those communities through residential schools after the fact. But to place a Gokwe or Two-Spirit in a position of spiritual importance for the well-being and vibrancy of the community is something that I think allows our faculty members to feel a sense of belonging. And as Alex Wilson has said, there's really only two sides to a circle, yeah? Either inside or outside. And for us, our Two-Spirited children need to know that they belong inside our circle, and we are going to do everything that we can to protect them. Right? And it's a story that I shared this last year at Congress as well, that, you know, if you look at a buffalo population, a community, we have several in Manitoba, the first thing they'll do when they sense danger is that the adults of that community will circle around the children, because they understand that there's nothing more important to the community than the young people. And the last thing I'll share with you, and then I'm going to close because I've taken too much time and we're running out of time. We've answered 2 questions out of 6. Is that the University of Winnipeg was the first university in all of Canada to implement an Indigenous course requirement. And I know that that's controversial. Behind the scenes also reached out to me personally to ask how they could do it as well, which I think will frame the conversation a little bit differently. And the other thing I'm going to say about the Indigenous course requirement is this. If it's not mandatory, who's teaching it to them? Because the most difficult question that I've gotten from our students, and I'm the administrative lead of that program, the most difficult question that I've gotten from my students, 88% of whom are non-Indigenous, who were, and watch what I'm doing here, forced to learn about their own Indigenous history as Canadians. The most difficult question that I've gotten from them is this, and I'm going to be totally honest with you. Why is this the first time that I'm learning about this? Which tells me that maybe there's something else going on here in terms of the importance of learning for reconciliation. Of the 94 calls to action, Wilton Littlechild has said that 72 of them are about education and awareness. And if that's true, then that means that post-secondary institutions have a responsibility to be on the front lines of reconciliation.
One of the things that happens, and Kevin mentioned the U15 and the smaller institutions, there's a collective of us across the country that get together and talk about our role in the most important public policy dialogue in Canada today. And we're a group of institutions that are not the U15. U15 are fabulous institutions, do fabulous things in the country, but it's very, very difficult for them to turn. They're big ships that are difficult to turn. Smaller institutions, University of Winnipeg, ourselves, Lakehead University, Nipissing, a number of these types of institutions get together on a regular basis and talk about what we're doing in this space. How are we doing it? Why are we doing it? What can we do as institutions that are cloaked in structures that make it very difficult? And part of that is about how we create and provide hands on the back for faculty members. One of the most important things that a faculty member comes into an institution, that they feel respected, they feel supported, and that they know what they're teaching is going to be important to it, even if it's very, very controversial. And academic freedom protects that for all of us at all of our institutions, but it doesn't mean that your colleagues and your peers are going to be supporting you. So how do you ensure that you have the dialogues with the institution where people feel the wraparound and they feel the supports and they feel the hands on the back? And that's something that has to be done deliberately to make sure that, in terms of recruiting, but particularly retaining faculty members, that they feel that support, they recognize that what they're doing is very important, and the work goes on. Thank you, Noel. Thank you very much. So that is a very important part. The challenge in terms of the systematic factors, or systemic factors that are barriers for us, there's so many of them that we could go through here. All the policies restrict preferential hiring. We kind of blow the doors off those, but they're still there. And a lot of people believe that you have to live by the black and white that's on the paper rather than breaking the rules. The depth of the pools. We talk about that a lot. The depth of the pools of people that are available within the context of all the programs across our institution. So that lack of candidates. The institutional stovepipes. They're incredibly strong, incredibly difficult to break down. And indeed, within the context of university structure, those are the types of things that really have to be addressed. And that means that you have to have deliberate dialogues within the institution where everybody's engaged. Otherwise, you're not going to get to the place where people feel a responsibility to engage and understand and to move these kind of dialogues forward. And that one is a challenge that I put out to every institution administrator and every institution faculty member in terms of accepting that. Because that's where you're going to learn, and especially when you can bring communities in to be a part of that dialogue. And the other one is that I think is extremely important is we're from different institutions in different parts of this country. When you think about the 633 nations in the country, or you think about the different language groups in the country, we're all different. We think about the public policy in Canada relative to treaty lands that Kevin was so articulate about. We're out on the West Coast where we've got some pre-Confederation treaties, we've got some New Age treaties, but there's a lot of the land, there's no treaties at all. So a completely different look at what you're doing, and indeed the cultures are so completely different. So any kind of federal or provincial policy that tries to deal with as a one-off just doesn't work. And that's why the institutions have to dialogue with the communities they serve and make sure that you're bringing in the communities to provide direction to the institution and support the institutions in learning. And as we saw from Noel, they're so welcoming and strong and are pretty sharp in criticism, which is great for the institutions. But it's where we have to go in terms of trying to move our institutions to a place where we can provide the kind of supports that are necessary for getting more faculty members into our institution. And then growing our own, breaking some of those rules that we have, and making sure that we're growing our own and providing the spaces that we have for people who can come in from the communities.
Me again. Okay, so my understanding is from the Truth and Reconciliation is mainly about the Euro-Canadians to look at themselves, to see what the role that they played in the injustice that has been actually exercised on the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And in that regard, each of the institutions actually need to do that, of doing an inventory as to what they look like from that point of view. So for me, that's a very important one. As a person walking in these white corridors, oh my gosh, sometimes it's like, what the heck did you just say? I remember sharing my Inuit background to one of my colleagues who I developed about 4 years of development of a sort of rapport. Well, the question that he posed at me was like, how do people eat whale? Oh my gosh, I can kind of imagine that he probably imagined me sitting there with a whale rib like. And I go like, how do I actually show him that I have a teeny little bags of frozen stuff that I put in my freezer? But can you just imagine that kind of situation? So for me, it translates into the actually ignorance of imagination on how people go about their lives. That's what it is. So it takes that of training of people around you. And also in the systems that exist in the evaluation system, we have quite a number of criteria that have been put forth for evaluating us as faculty members, including that of the evaluation of basically students that are totally new to the world of having to figure out what the Indigenous knowledge was about. In those kinds, for example, I have been evaluated by one of the students that I lied every time that I came into the classroom. That every time I came into the classroom, I didn't know which lie I was going to be holding on to for my lecture. Every day, every time. That's the evaluation. And I go like, okay, who do you believe? Me or the student, right? And here is the institution and university at large wanting to do that, of keeping values of truth and reconciliation. So it trickles down to everything, as you are saying, in terms of having to look at programs, courses, teaching on how, what is it reflecting in anything. So we have research applications, research programs at the University of Saskatchewan that do not necessarily adhere to the truth and reconciliation at this point, and certainly not Indigenous knowledge. And so these are some of the stuff that really needs to be looked at. Training of the staff, training of the faculty, training of the students to actually be part of this one here is a very important one. And to me, these are really important things, but that of the knowledge in form of value system as it relates to the land is one of the most important ones as far as I'm concerned, because, for example, here in Saskatchewan we have large number of students entering universities, both Regina as well as University of Saskatchewan, that really do not appreciate the land for what it is, namely that it gives us life, it gives us imagination. And maybe do so in the future in a way that speaks to the collective ancestry in form of the fact that First Nations, the Métis, have been actually praying a lot of their prayers for us to be able to enjoy the lives that we do today. I have myself, because of the fact that I'm Inuit, been trying to impress upon the College of Education faculty meetings, when they do indeed do that, of recognizing the traditional lands of the First Nations and Métis, to be inclusive of Inuit, because Inuit gave up a lot of lands to the federal government in their Inuit land claims. What do I get? Well, it's like recognition of the Treaty 6 and Métis and the rest of the indigenous populations of the world. That's what I'm getting so far. Not mention of Inuit, and that to me is very problematic when Inuit are indeed part of the psyche of what Canadianism is about. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to add more than just one little complaint. I've got to go deal with a issue with my, I have to take something for my grandson to his class here by 1, so I just wanted to say one thing. You know, one of the challenges that I've experienced, and I don't think I'm the only one, that, you know, a colleague of mine, and we had some conversations with in regards to the pursuit. There is a private donation given to an institution, and they were going to name a scholar on an Indigenous topic. And they appointed a non-Indigenous scholar who's a really, really super nice person, amazing person. He's, you know, and one of the things that he's done, he's developed a research portfolio on Indigenous issues. So he was given that without consideration for some other Indigenous scholars that I would argue would be ideal for that role, right? So, to me, there is this whole process of developing knowledge in our Western institutions is, you know, I had another conversation with somebody who we are going to do a presentation together, and he said, so I actually, we get together before the presentation and had a quick meeting, and you know, I actually said I'm not going to present with you, and the reason why I did that though is because he never did anything. All he did was a little bit of secondary research, and he put together this presentation about a business issue related to Indigenous people. And after that, he would walk away from there and put this on his CV. And if he did that enough, he'd be an expert pretty quickly without ever having to participate or interact with Indigenous people. So I said, you know what, I don't want to help in that regard. So me and him didn't do the presentation. He didn't do the presentation with me, right? So you know, that whole, I think that we still have lots of work to do, and you know, many discussions like this need to occur, and we need to fill up rooms and have these discussions and debates for. I think it's going to take some time. Thank you.
So I'll just be quick with a few wrap-up points here, and it is a little after 12 now, so I know people have to be places. But at SFU, we've gone from 2 Indigenous faculty members to about 20, and this is over since the early 2000s to now, so 2 to approximately 20. I say approximately because there's processes happening as we speak at this time. Mostly in 2 clusters, in FAS and in education. And the reasons for this are a priority being put on these hires by the faculties themselves, and a faculty hiring plan that my previous office had worked with the Vice President of Academics office on, where VPA would pay the first 3 years of an new Indigenous faculty hires salary and benefits for 3 years, and then the faculty would take up the money and benefits after that. And he allowed 2 applications a year, and this started about 4 years ago, so we've had about 5 hires under that new Indigenous faculty hiring plan, so that plan is going to continue as well. But we find an escalation occurring that even faculties, because all these hires are happening, they're getting into the spirit of it and aren't waiting for that money, but are going ahead and doing their own hires by convincing deans to sponsor these hires accordingly. Challenges are we hire Indigenous scholars. We don't hire First Nation specific, Métis specific, Inuit specific. I'd really like to see that happen, though I'm status First Nations myself. I've always been supportive of Métis and Inuit, the hiring of those scholars as well. But we haven't sort of reached that stage. And so one thing that could be done, especially for Inuit scholars, because I know there's not a lot of Inuit scholars that have their PhD. In fact, we tried to offer a sessional course on Northern Arctic Métis, Inuit issues. Yeah, and nobody applied. There was no one to even apply to teach a sessional course. Not even a grad student was Inuit yet there. This was about 3-4 years ago. I was going to do it because I've taught Inuit as part of my teaching background, but I couldn't because of my very busy admin job. So when I was first breaking in the business in the late 1980s, going back to university, the senior Indigenous scholars at SFU at the time were those who just had master's degrees, and they were allowed to, or as part of their job, completed their PhD degrees. So this happened early for First Nations people. So I believe that this is the kind of thing we need to allow and prioritize for Inuit and Métis scholars as well. So I'm sorry we had so many interesting people here today, lots to say. We didn't get a chance to get through all the questions per se, but I think their answers to those questions were weaved throughout their other comments as well. And it's been a real pleasure and honor being part of this group today. And I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions or comments, but if you'd like to come up after we're done, you can come on up and talk to us as well.
Thank you. I'm deeply, deeply honored and deeply touched to have been part of this, and thank you for sharing your knowledges with us. And I'd like to thank our local Indigenous communities and hosts, but also our mentioned Inuit lands as well. So thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Okay. All right.
So thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Very good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, as we say in my language.